Good evening. Can you all hear me? Is the mic on? Yeah. Okay, we're going to give everyone just a second to make their way in. So I want to start by a warm welcome to everyone. And we sincerely appreciate your presence at tonight's talk. You're in for a real treat with Dr. Miller. My name is Ann White. I'm the executive director of Lead with Love. We're a local nonprofit that works to shift culture from fear to love. Pre-COVID, Lead with Love would have asked you to turn to your neighbor and give them a warm hug. Instead, tonight, I ask you to take a moment to turn to your neighbor and welcome them with a kind smile. Might be your eyes. It's absolutely wonderful to be together again. I'd like to start by introducing you to this evening's moderator, Executive Director of Aspen Institute's Religion and Society Program, Dr. Simran Jeet Singh. Just today, his book, The Light We Give, How Sikh Wisdom Can Transform Your Life, made the LA Times bestsellers list. Congratulations. I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to a handful of remarkable individuals who have made tonight possible. First, to a powerhouse group of women who came together to welcome Dr. Miller and her delightful husband, Phil. I don't see Phil yet. Where is he? To our dynamic Aspen community, Melanie Lewis, Tilly Walton, Kelly Hallman, and Lead with Love's very own Gina Murdock. Woo. Amazing. I would also like to thank Zoe Brown and Crystal Logan of the Aspen Institute for their tireless dedication to bring meaningful dialogue to our community. So thank you. They're around here somewhere. I have the privilege to introduce tonight's guest speaker, Dr. Lisa Miller, who gives me reason to be optimistic, albeit a hero's journey ahead. Dr. Lisa Miller is the New York Times bestselling author of The Spiritual Child and her new book, The Awakened Brain. For 22 years, she has been a professor in the clinical psychology program at the Teachers College of Columbia University, where she is the founder of the Spirituality Mind-Body Institute, the first Ivy League graduate program and research institute in spirituality and psychology, and has held over a decade of joint appointments in the Department of Psychiatry at Columbia University Medical School. Dr. Miller's innovative research has been published in more than 100 peer-reviewed articles in leading journals, including Cerebral Cortex, the American Journal of Psychiatry, and the Journal of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. Dr. Miller is editor of the Oxford University Press Handbook of Psychology and Spirituality, founding co-editor-in-chief of the APA Journal, Spirituality in Clinical Practice, and elected fellow of the American Psychological Association, and two-time president of the APA Society for Psychology and Spirituality. A graduate of Yale University and University of Pennsylvania, where she earned her doctorate under the founder of positive psychology, Professor Martin Seligman. She served as principal investigator on multiple grant-funded research studies. Dr. Miller speaks and consults on the awakened brain and on the spiritual child for universities. They recently had 500 at their summit. The U.S. military, businesses, including tech, finance, HR, and sales, personal development, faith-based organizations, K through 12 schools, and for mental health and wellness initiatives around the globe. Dr. Miller and Dr. Jeet Singh will be signing books in the lobby after they speak. And to conclude, I'd like to share Dr. Miller's favorite quote, my favorite quote by Dr. Miller, and lead with Love's favorite quote. An awakened heart is the seat of unity with all life. Welcome.
I am absolutely thrilled to be here with you, you who lead and seed civil society. And so I'm going to share with you the best thing I have with love, with hope, that you will then have one more arrow in your quiver as you continue within your own band of personal and professional expertise to help renew our world. Here's the best thing I have. When I share it, I always honor my teacher. Dr. Gary Weaver taught me this practice. This is a 90-second practice. I'm going to invite you to close your eyes, clear out your inner space, and take 5 breaths. I invite you to set before you a table. In the inner chamber of your being, a table. And to this table, you may invite anyone, living or deceased, who truly has your best interest in mind. Anyone living or deceased who truly has your best interest in mind. And with them all sitting there, ask them if they love you. And now you may invite your higher self, the part of you that is so much more than anything that you've done or not done, anything you have or not have, your true, eternal, higher self. And ask you if you love you. And now finally, you may invite your higher power, however you know, whatever word you may use, your higher power. And ask your higher power if they love you. And now with all of those people sitting there right now, what do they need to share? What do they need to tell you now? What do you need to know? And when you're ready, I invite you back. This is your birthright. Who shows up at your table may change, depending on where you are in your journey, and you may ask them what is on your heart. And as you know, all traditions through time have held an understanding of a transcendent relationship with our higher power, our higher self, and those who truly have our best interest in mind. What if we were to consider the realization of this capacity and its implications for our current challenges in civil society? And focusing on that which Surgeon General Vivek Murthy, in a once in an administration, brought to our attention in December. As a country, we have never faced as elevated rates of addiction, depression, and even suicide in young adults, the diseases of despair. Some of you may remember the Surgeon General has determined that smoking may be dangerous for your health. This is on that scale. And yet we have a body of basic science, and it's referenced in the back of your book, which points to a possibility for not just recovery, but renewal, not bouncing back, but bouncing ahead. In the epidemic of the diseases of despair and in the host of questions and challenges that go side by side at this current moment. As we exit the pandemic, returning to baseline doesn't seem to satisfy many people. Historical data alone seems not to point a way forward. But what is deep within our inner capacity to perceive, to know, that can envision, if you will, a spiritual renaissance? So let's state the problem, starting with the young adults. Mental health, rates of suicide that now rival the rate of auto accident in high school, pushing into middle school. I'm a parent of 3 children. My youngest came to me not long ago, Mama, look at this, look on the phone. This girl, look, Mama, she's gonna take her life. And I read, this is it, I can't take it. The pain is too great. It's been too long, 2 weeks, I'm taking my life. What would you have said to her had you found that posting? And what might you imagine when you were 15 might have been said to her? Tell your mother, hold on, get help. Tomorrow things will change. Have hope. Underneath the call was, you go, girl. It's your life. You take it if you want. What has happened to the sanctity of life? Well, in this portrait in which we look at individual young adults and teens one by one, noting the different levels of pathology, it is perhaps more helpful to look at the culture and climate, the tidal wave, if you will, that is lifting and drowning all of our young adults. 40 years ago, in the very good attempt to be inclusive, we threw all religion and spirituality out of the public square. And with that went the spiritual baby with the bathwater. And with that, we became a non-conversant society around spiritual life. And we lost precious pluralism, one of the finest qualities of our country. Well, 40 years is long enough for someone to grow up, have a baby who grows up and is at our door in high school, in college, at the US Army, at an entry-level job. 40 years has passed, and with the elevated rates of the diseases of despair has come concomitantly an equal decline in personal spiritual life, family faith. Now, religion and spirituality through the lens of science are not the same thing. They go hand in hand for 70% of people in the United States. 70% of people in this country say, I am spiritual and I am religious. My deep transcendent relationship, such as you just experienced now, is held in the prayers, the language, the symbols, the community, the values of my tradition. And 30% say, I am spiritual, but I am not religious. For me, nature is my cathedral. Art, music, my family. Whether or not we are religious, what we now know through 25 years of peer-reviewed science is that we are all spiritual beings. And in particular, scientists do not define spirituality. We identify threads of lived human spirituality that carry enormous consequence on the rest of our lives. And 2 of the threads that are tremendously game-changing are that we have a direct connection to source, energy, spirit, God, Jesus, Hashem, Allah, the beautiful names, how it may be embraced, and that we see this ultimate presence in one another through love of neighbor. These 2 dimensions are our birthright. These 2 forms of transcendent relationship are our birthright, what you just experienced now. Through the lens of science, we can chart a blueprint onto the nature of human spirituality, its unfolding over the decades of our lives, and how spirituality comes to bear in times of great loss and trauma, as well as how spirituality is present, for instance, at the birth of a child, and renews us. I'm going to share with you in brief, because I have very little time, but it's in the book, the core findings that are essential to our conversation today. The first is that every single being on earth, every human being is a spiritual being, with or without a faith tradition. Through the lens of science, we use a twin study to determine the extent to which any trait is heritable or environmentally formed. Temperament is about half and half. IQ is 60% innate, 40% environmentally formed. The capacity through which we experience what you just did, the transcendent relationship, is 1/3 innate. We all have this. Now, of course, there's human variability. For instance, you may compose, and I enjoy appreciating or dancing to your music. But we both have a capacity to experience music and rhythm. There is in us an inherent capacity for spiritual life, a transcendent awareness along those two dimensions. 2/3 environmentally formed means that the rich embrace of our parents, grandparents are tremendously important. Pastor, priest, imam, rabbi, 10,000 exchanges by the high school locker all say, who are we on earth? How do we treat each other? And what is our ultimate purpose? Every exchange carries a spiritual dimension along with an interpersonal and a physical and all else. When we hit puberty, not just age, biological puberty, which is why we speak now to schools, there is a surge from the inside out, a biological clock. It's marked by a 50% increase in the heritable contribution in longitudinal twin studies. Bring, whether or not anyone told us it's coming. What is my purpose? What is my meaning? Actually, what is the purpose, the meaning? And all around the world, we have studies that cross Ukraine and Canada and Cameroon and Thailand. Sure, there's the beautiful, rich embrace of unique culture. Of course, there's different language and symbol, but core burgeoning with this surge. Who am I on earth? What is not just my purpose? Do I become an artist, a mathematician? But what is my purpose in relationship to ultimate reality? The booting up of the spiritual capacity with puberty. As we track changing our physical appearance, we grow spiritually. Can feel like a half-empty glass of spirituality. And that's always, not just during a pandemic. College counselors tell me 2/3 of my caseload is not really classic DSM diagnosis. It is what I call developmental depression. Ultimate meaning, ultimate purpose. And if we don't know if there is one, that is a chilly place to be. The good news is you. Because the rich 2/3 embrace during this accelerated window, this high impact window, mean that who you are as grandparents and parents, teachers, guides, coaches, healers, has an extraordinary formative impact on the spiritual core. And when the spiritual core is formed, there is nothing in the clinical or social sciences as profoundly protective against Surgeon General Vivek Murthy's call to address the diseases of despair. We have the antidote. A teen, a standard deviation above as compared to below the mean, and a tendency to say my personal spirituality is highly important to me, is at 80% decreased risk of addiction using DSM criteria. That's the difference between saying I feel deeply connected to God, my higher power. I feel spirit when I walk through the forest versus I don't really know what you're talking about. 80% decreased versus 80% increased relative risk for addiction. And so too, the magnitude of these protective benefits is not found in the clinical sciences. Usually things are less than 1/3 this great. This is our birthright. And facing now, my last bit of science, where we are now, this is a sample of 3,000 people, all to have survived trauma. And I invite you into a reflection of the past couple of years. What we see here is with increased levels of trauma, more struggle, more anxiety, more revisiting, are increased levels of growth. More struggle, more growth, more struggle, more growth. Until we get so far out here, and everyone here has PTSD, so it's way out here, that we're so flooded with struggle, we need support to grow. Struggle, trauma, depression is a knock at the door for a deepening of spiritual life. We are hardwired. And when we strengthen the spiritual core, this is what we do. Broad and pervasive regions, represented in red, of cortical thickness, the cortex is processing power, sustained spiritual life over 8 years is associated with structural differences in the parietal, precuneus, occipital regions of perception. And when we look a year out from when we looked at these brains, a strong spiritual brain, an awakened brain, is protective against level of depression a year from now. And even more, these regions are not thick, but thin when we have recurrent major depression. In short, sustained spiritual life is neuroprotective against recurrent depression. And not only that, but these people represented here, those who said my personal spirituality is highly important to me, were 250%, 2.5 times more likely to have suffered in the decade leading to this moment. And yet when spiritual deepening and awakening became foundational to their lives, they were 75% protected against a subsequent depression that went up to 90% when they were at high risk. So we are built to deepen. Suffering is the doorway to spiritual awakening. And with that, I will thank you, invite you into the science. Thank you so much.
Good evening. It's great to be with you. Before I turn back to Dr. Miller, I just want to tell you how special it is to be in this conversation for me, because I shared this with her yesterday. The year before my oldest daughter was born, Dr. Miller's book on the spiritual child came out. And what better gift can you receive from someone to help raise your child with happiness and love? So thank you. It's also special because Dr. Miller and I, where we teach, we're both on 120th and Broadway in New York. We've probably crossed paths with one another walking or on the subway, running in Central Park as you do. And like good New Yorkers, we've probably never acknowledged one another. So thank you, Aspen, for bringing us together. Part of what you talk about in the book is synchronicity. And that's sort of what I feel here, not just because of our connection geographically and what you raise here, but also I found in reading your book, The Awakened Brain, there's so much mirroring in terms of my own personal worldview and my lived experience and what I find in your book. And I'm very pleased to be able to have this conversation with you. Now, before we really get into the conversation, I want to go back to where you started, and that is the profound mental health crisis we're facing in this country. And I want you to help situate us here with regard to what's happening, because it's unprecedented. I pulled up some numbers to share with you all. From 2010 to 2020, we lost nearly 500,000 lives here in this country to suicide. During that same period, the suicide death rate increased by 12%. In the first year of the pandemic, right? So let's go beyond those numbers. The WHO found that the global prevalence of anxiety and depression jumped 25% around the world. 25%, first year. And according to the Boston University School of Public Health, the elevated rate of depression in the US has persisted into 2021, and it now affects 1 in every 3 Americans. So if you look around this room, if you look at the people next to you, 1 out of every 3 people. We don't see numbers, we haven't seen numbers like this. And I'd love for you to help us understand, what are you seeing from your view as a scientist, as somebody who's studying this, as a parent, as a psychologist? What are you seeing with regard to depression and anxiety and suicide?
So, I'll share a story. I work with the Pentagon, and the chief of chaplains at the Pentagon, Chaplain Tom Soljan, he's a 2-star general, used to gather up the soldiers after a tough day, and he said, we were like Daniel today. And they'd all say, wow. Now he says, we were like Daniel today. And they're like, who's Daniel? One of our squad, Daniel. So there's absolutely no learning for a great number of teens and young adults around spiritual principles, around our natural birthright for transcendent awareness, love, connection, guidance, as we saw through the inner exercise, the counsel practice. When I look at 25 years of peer-reviewed science, it's very clear that in the making of a whole person is a strong spiritual core. And the tidal wave of culture and the air and water of our culture, we have not supported the deep, strong spiritual core growing up in K-12 education, even in popular culture in many of our homes. And what we see now is a disintegrated young adult. And what that looks like is suffering, what that looks like is despair, and frankly, what that looks like is a lack of relational ethics. Remarkably, our broad and pervasive problems around fragility, ethics, and health in young people have one core solution. And it is a great gift that the young person is crossing through a time where they are highly impacted by the contributions of those who walk by their side, a spiritual walk. So you're very important. You're important to your family, you're important to your classrooms, and you're important in your leadership. You're like a picnic blanket. You spread out your way of being, your spiritual way of being everywhere you go. And that is the 2/3 embrace, the environmental strengthening of the spiritual core.
I want to hear more about how the orientation towards spirituality affects the human brain, where you were taking us with the slides. But first, just a definitional piece. Spirituality can mean different things to different people. And so when you were talking about spirituality, can you help us understand, what do you mean by spirituality? What are we talking about?
So for a long time, in the 80s and 90s, scientists would sit around, really like theologians from centuries gone by, and say, I think spirituality is peace and wisdom. And the next person would say, no, I think spirituality is interconnected. And basically recreating the theological wheel. And finally, in the most beautiful breakthrough article in 1997, a twin study was published, and for the first time it was shown by Ken Kendler that we are all endowed with a natural capacity for spiritual life. And while scientists don't define spirituality, we can identify threads of lived human spiritual life, and that which is innate is what we did here together today, a deep transcendent relationship to the higher power, and that we experience the higher power in and through one another, love of neighbor.
Would it be as simple as saying, and please build on this if I'm not exactly there, would it be as simple as saying it's connection to ourselves and to one another, to a higher power? How many elements are there here?
So if I might defer to another brain study. Sorry, my husband's in the crowd. He says, don't do too much science. but this is a good one. When we invited people of all faith traditions, whether they were Catholic, Hindu, Muslim, Jewish, spiritual but not religious, into the functional MRI, the movie camera MRI that tracks blood flow. And we asked them, tell us about a time where you felt a deep personal connection to your higher power, God, Jesus, spirit, force in nature, whatever your word may be. These were 18 through 25-year-olds in New Haven, about 2/3 students, 1/3 people living in the city. Nobody was confused. No one was confused by that question. And in fact, many people said, I'm so glad to talk about this because no one's ever asked. And when people of all traditions then repeated their story within the fMRI. The story went like this. I'm walking down the sidewalk. I've just been dumped by my boyfriend of 3 years. I thought we were going to get married. I feel so despairing, so low, so unappealing. But then I went home, and sitting by my grandparents and parents in our house of worship, I realized, of course I'm loved. And in fact, there's love all around us. I will love again. Or it sounds like this. I was just turned down at 6 out of 7 medical schools. I'm thinking I'll never be a doctor like my mother and father. But then I saw light in the leaves, and I know that God has a plan for me, and I will be a healer in the way that I am intended. A complete reshuffling of meaning. Whether I am of any faith or beautiful faith traditions or spiritual but not religious. And with that went 3 loops in the brain. The awareness, like we just shared, that we are loved and held. The bonding network comes online, just as we were held as children. A shift from the top down to the bottom up, attention from the dorsal to the ventral, attention network, through which we see a far more broad range of opportunities. Instead of, I'm never gonna love again, I'm never gonna get into medical school. Then I saw light in the leaves. And many people say our attention is pulled. And not only are we loved and held and guided through this shift in attention, but we realize, as the parietal puts in and out hard boundaries, that we are never alone. I can be walled off in my COVID apartment, but at the same time, I am part of the family of life, the field of creation. And what that means is that each of us we're a point and we're a wave. That's how I explain it to my Columbia students. We are magnificently unique and beautifully diverse in our zipped up bio bodysuit and have different GPS coordinates, and we are white caps on one ocean. We are part of one unit of creation. So loved, held, guided, and never alone is our birthright. We just shared it. And not only that, but we can see one another so as to always be loving, holding, guiding, and never leave anyone alone. That is the dimension of spirituality that was identified in twin studies as heritable, which we operationalized after 2 years of planning in the MRI, and which showed to be true across people of all traditions and spiritual but not religious. This is who we are.
That's great, thank you. So connect the dots for us. What we're hearing you say is spiritual practice transforms the brain in some way, affects the brain, and how your brain changes then affects your well-being. What is happening to your brain during this period? And I'm setting you up to talk about more science, so you're welcome. What is happening to your brain through this process? Are we tapping into something that's already there? Are we transforming something that's there? Is some physical change happening? All of the above?
So in the first 2/3 of the awakened brain, I shared the neural correlates of both despair and depression as an invitation. We are hardwired through struggle to deepen spiritually. It is the perfect time to deepen spiritually in our own lives and as a society. Here, now, this is our doorway forward. The last third in the awakened brain is a beautiful burgeoning science that looks not at the nature of our brain as held within the skull, but rather sees our brain as we are part of the wave, part of the oneness. And if I may, just one little study. There was a scientist named Achterhoff who had 2 MRIs. She put one in one building and one in another. And in the first MRI, this was done in Hawaii, a traditional healer started to do his or her work, and a predictable, consistent pattern came on the MRI. Within an instant, in another building, in another MRI, the patient showed the same pattern. One thing, healing consciousness, in 2 places, superposition. And I invite you to reflect where deep in your gut, in your heart, you maybe knew something was wrong with one of your kids. Or you maybe felt this great joy and love and someone was thinking of you or praying for you. We are a point and we are a wave, and the brain is built to see, feel, and know, perceive both realities.
That's great, thank you. Okay, so one of the elements you talked about in your scans that you showed us was cortical thickening. Not something I'd heard of before. Sounds kind of gross. What is cortical
beautiful.
thickening? Now that I understand it, So what's beautiful about it? What does it do in terms of how we experience our lives differently once it starts thickening?
Thank you. So by way of analogy, the spiritual core, this is the language actually that we use in the Army, just as we have physical fitness for the physical core, spiritual fitness, embrace, practice, walking the walk in our values and our consciousness practices, strengthens the spiritual core. And you saw in the red brains the strengthened spiritual core, the broad and pervasive regions of cortical thickness. Now, the brain is our lens. It's how we see life. So I could live in the same house with the same family and have the same job, and it all looks different when seen through the awakened brain that has been practiced and strengthened. And even more, when we invited those people to have recovered from depression through a deepening of spiritual life into the lab, they gave off a wavelength, high amplitude alpha. High amplitude alpha is the wavelength given off when we jumpstart recovery, and again, one does what they need, right, through SSRIs. But even if I'm taking SSRIs, can I still do the spiritual work that's being called for me? And high amplitude alpha is given off the back of a head of a meditating monk. High amplitude alpha has another name. It is Schumann's resonance. The spiritually engaged brain vibrates with the same wavelength that is found all the way around the Earth, from the Earth's crust up 1 mile. Our felt sense of return to nature, the oneness we feel in nature, is mirrored by the singularity of the wavelength. So I think my children, certainly my grandchildren, will say, Grandma was such a riot. She looked at sacred consciousness in terms of its wavelength. And yet, that the spiritually engaged brain vibrates with the wavelength of all nature means we return to our nature. We return to creation. And last night, a beautiful little boy said, when I go out into nature, it feels the way it should be.
It's powerful. So let's take the science and what you're sharing with us to a practical level. If we are interested in applying some of what you've uncovered in your research into our daily lives, what are some concepts that you think are resonant that we could understand? What are some practices that we might incorporate into our daily living so that we might ourselves become more spiritually connected?
Beautiful. So I offer a roadmap drive through basic science, and I'll give you a shortcut. We looked all around the world. We looked in India, we looked in China, we looked in the US, and knowing that there's a heritable basis to our spiritual awareness, there must be common phenotypes. And it's on the back of those phenotypes that we might use this blueprint to build our spiritual life. I'll share with them briefly. All around the world, of course, there's human variability, but it is seen in every country in its deep experiential structure, the phenotypes of an on-ramp to spiritual awareness, a deep perception of love as a mutative force, not just like happiness and emotion, but like gravity and magnetism. Love is transformative. That we are both a point and a wave, that we are one and deeply interconnected. An on-ramp through which we perceive deep love and interconnection. An off-ramp of morals derived from a relationship to ultimate reality, not cherry-picked or driven by hedonics. An on-ramp, love and interconnection, morals built in relationship to ultimate reality, and the fifth phenotype is altruism. And it doesn't matter if I'm in India, the US, or China, and in that sample we caught the representation of the 7 most highly represented faith traditions. There's one spiritual brain, and we all have it. Religious war is extremely outdated. So on that roadmap, we can build a practice of transcendence. For some, it's walking through the cathedral of nature. For some, it's meditation, heart-centered meditation. For some, it's prayer. We can be aware that our perception of unitive love and oneness is perceiving something real. We take inner experience, mystical experience, gut instincts as hard data. And finally, the off-ramp. Who are we to each other? What are our morals and how do we treat each other? And sometimes it can feel as if it's barely above legal. There's a big confusion about what's legal and moral. But really, of all the 5 phenotypes of spiritual life all around the world, the one that most correlates with the spiritual brain, the cortex, high-powered spiritual brain, is love of neighbor, altruism. So if we're stuck, we can move our feet and do what in our heart we want to do anyway, which is love our neighbor.
Yeah, I'm noticing that I only have 5 more minutes before I have to share you. So I'll save my anecdote because I also have about 10 questions. Here's a question that's sort of emerging from what you just said. What I'm hearing you propose is that there are 5 phenotypes that we can identify scientifically.
At least. There could be others we didn't get.
But 5 that you've identified so far. And many religions have these components. Would you say it could potentially be enough for us to just identify what those phenotypes are and develop our own spiritual practices for each of them? Meaning, could I say, altruism for me looks like this. Let me practice it every day. Love for me looks like this. And it doesn't, like, just leave religion aside. Or do you see having some sort of guidance around this? Some lived experience, some wisdom traditions. Is there a difference between how this comes together?
So I'll answer you with the lyrical voice of science. And it goes like this. I have a very dear colleague who was once my TA in college, who became my colleague, who spent a decade looking at children in poverty. And simply as a control group, one fall decided, let's put in a well-resourced community to see what differences are found. And to her shock, Dr. Sonia Luther found in highly resourced communities higher rates of addiction, depression, suicide, and sociopathy than in profoundly under-resourced communities. And so she looked under the hood. What could have caused this? Where's the tidal wave? And she went to very well-resourced schools outside of New York, outside of San Francisco, rounded up students and said, tell me, who's really popular here? And everybody knew. They said, oh, well, that group of girls is very popular, and that boy, he's very popular. Dr. Luther came back a week later, rounded up new students and said, tell me about those girls and that fellow. And in this way determined the actual lived behavior of highly popular people in highly resourced communities. So if you might imagine, what you sense is the #1 predictor of popularity in girls. Is within that bandwidth. It was weight, parts and pieces. We took spirituality out of the public square and everything is a transaction, parts and pieces. And the second predictor was cruelty, mean girls, like the shows we've seen. Interpersonal aggression to instantiate rank. In boys, beautiful souls on earth, they come, spiritual beings. First predictor of popularity, substance use. The popular boys use drugs. And the second was not intimacy, but notches on the belt, exploitation. So these beautiful souls are in a tidal wave. I teamed up with Dr. Luther some years into her study, and I said, where's spirituality in all this? And together we looked at that question. Well, the national rate at which a young person raises his or her hand and says, my personal spirituality is highly important to me. Nature is a sacred home. I turn to my higher power for guidance, live transcendent relationship that we just shared. National rate is 70%. But in highly resourced communities, extremely well-resourced communities, what might you anticipate was the rate of personal spirituality? Everybody knows. It was less than a quarter of the national rate, 15%. And those in the 15% were protected against the otherwise elevated rates of the diseases of despair. How do I get my 3 kids into that 15%? Without exception, all of the students, the high school students, the 15% who said my personal spirituality is highly important to me, were in families that were part of either a faith community or a community of contribution. There was somewhere else to go, away from the locker, where the moment I walk in to the faith-based community or Habitat for Humanity or a restorative process, I'm viewed as a soul on earth. And it doesn't matter if I just got turned down at 6 colleges or got into 6 colleges, if my dad just made $1 million or is on the paper for being in jail. It doesn't matter. You look at me with love, because in a faith-based community, in a spiritual community, in an altruistic community of service, we are souls on earth. We are children of God. We are emanations of life. And that's how we see each other. That is the gift that we give our children and grandchildren. And that is the embrace of the spiritual core that sets them up for resilience. 80% less likely to be addicted. If you told me I could take this little pill and crush it up in the cereal of my kids, 80% less likely to be addicted, 4/5 less likely to take your life in an epidemic of suicide, and yet this is our birthright, just waiting to be touched and realized.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Beautiful. Thank you for those questions.
I'll invite you all. We have about 15 minutes with Dr. Miller. If you'd raise your hand, and I can point over to you, and we will have a mic come your way before you ask. There's one up here in the middle. There's a mic on your side over here.
I was interested in what they found in the lower resource community that led to more stability and the good things you're talking about.
Thank you. As you're suggesting, there were much higher rates of spirituality, and oftentimes religion and spirituality hand in hand. And it's very interesting because we have looked at spiritually supportive schools all over the country, given this roadmap of science, that there is nothing as important in the formation of the teen or young adult as a strong spiritual core. I mean, it doesn't matter what activities or what teacher or anything else, it matters that that teacher, that coach, cares about the spiritual core. So that is what is most important. It turns out that when we visited schools with far less resources, people were actually freely talking about spirituality. It was only in the higher resource communities that it was taboo to discuss spiritual life. And the way that that can be reconciled in a way that's inclusive and constitutional is the same way we do it in the Army, which is to take a student-centered or a soldier-centered point of view. I want to know you. I want to know what's important to you. And if you tell me that your grandma just died, but you felt her, I want to know that because you just told me the most important thing in your life. So I'm glad you asked. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
Up here in the...
Oh, sorry.
That's...
Excuse me.
No, go ahead. Oh, there's a microphone coming for you.
Thank you. The Deepak Chopra and Rudolph Tanzi book on Superbrain discusses the whole idea of the mind being over the brain, which is sort of like a heart is a pump and the kidney's a filter. And it seems to me that your awakened brain needs to teach our mindful, the mind, to teach the brain how to do its job. What would that look like?
Thank you. That's such a fantastic question. So almost never to be published is how the brain actually works. Is the brain like a factory, the producer of thoughts? That's a very 20th century notion, that thoughts are made inside the hermetically sealed skull. Another view is that the brain is like an antenna. It receives consciousness. That's a very implicit idea that I see in my students at Columbia and Barnard, that somehow, because they've grown up with phones, you can pull consciousness out of the air. It doesn't have to be through a telephone line, right? So we have the brain as a maker, a mechanistic model. We have a brain as a receptor, like an antenna. And then another vision of the brain is that it is a reification of consciousness, turning consciousness into matter, that consciousness exists both within the state of matter and outside of the state of matter. And that's a view that I think explains a lot of things such as synaptogenesis and the changes in our brain. So science has not, as a community, even begun to explore the power of the question you've asked. But what we can say is that there are neurocorrelates that go hand in hand with profound spiritual experiences, and that those experiences in time craft our brain to be that much more attuned to the deeper sacred, transcendent reality in life. I put it in the awakened brain, I tell it a different way, a little bit different. I say we have our achieving brain, which we need. In the Army, that's strategy, tactic, readiness. But as we know, coming out of COVID, and as you as leaders know, that there's a great deal of import. In fact, some of the most important things in life we do not control. There's a very thin layer of control on a big pound cake of flux. And special ops knows that, and you as leaders know that. So when that which is controlled breaks down, as we've just experienced, we can shift from saying, this is what I want out of life, this is what I want out of this project, this is our goal, to saying, wow, let's have a different conversation with life. What is life showing me now? And that's a shift from being narrowly makers of our path to being discoverers of our journey, with surprises and awesome discoveries. And sometimes it hurts, and sometimes it's so beautiful. But at the end, we are so capable of love. And we realize and know that we are loved and held and guided. And we realize and know that we are never alone. Our awakened awareness.
Thank you. Over here in the side.
Hi. Children's Hospital has said that it's a state of emergency of mental health with children. So how do you see getting solution out as quickly as possible? What type of levers are you seeing that are effective, and how others can help with that?
Thank you. I think the most important piece from science is that there is a natural spirituality. We can step out of the conversation that when I listen to your spiritual heart and what's on your soul, right? I'm somehow breaching the Constitution. You have free expression of your spiritual life. And just as we would not deprive a child of school lunch and starve her, or of recess, knowing that there is a scientifically documented natural spirituality means that this is a human capacity which is essential to whole child functioning. This is a human capacity which doesn't just lead us to renewal, but allows us to grow. The spiritual core is essential. So here are ways that I've seen it used. At Harvard McLean Hospital, when a patient comes in, they're asked 3 questions. Everybody gets asked, is your personal spirituality or religion important to you? Does it have something to do with what's going on now, you coming to the inpatient unit and suffering? And would you like engagement here around your spiritual life? That's one way I've seen it done in a hospital. The Army, I've worked for 2 years with the Pentagon, and what we've done is we have educated all leadership tiers of the Army into this science so that they now have the embedded skill, the lens, through which to see every soldier. Authorized them. We talk about spirituality here. Authorized them based on science. And we now have a basic training, FM 722, Chapter 10, that says a soldier must be fit physically, mentally, and spiritually. Now, they don't need to religiously look like their commander. That's not what that's saying. It's saying there's a natural spirituality, and in whatever walk is that soldier's walk is essential, because that is the way that we can recover from trauma. Build the ark before it rains. Do the vaccine, a little strengthening now. What the Army then did, because I think it's a beautiful model for large organizations, is having all of the leadership gain this lens. They trained an arterial network of chaplains, and they don't have to be chaplains, to be universal in the way that they work with someone. The ministry of presence, walking by their side through the dark night of the soul, universal notions. And now we have in behavioral health teams that have both the chaplain and behavioral health. And now at intake, you meet your commander, you meet the chaplain, you meet behavioral health. And now there's a different conversation. The Army changed the tidal wave. They changed culture and climate. And in Q1 of this year, there was a 28% decrease in rates of suicide in the Army over last year, Q1, over the 5-year average. And that was not found in civil society, if we look at the CDC, or other branches of the military that are yet to start this. So there's really reason to help, God willing. God willing.
And Lisa's being very gracious, not to pitch some of her own work that she's been developing, but there's a powerful intervention around Awakened Schools, I believe, and I think Anne will tell you about a gathering that will be here in Aspen in September around Awakened Schools and
Great.
what the opportunities are.
That's a really important point. Should I put that
Please.
out there and Anne can pick it up, which
Please.
is this roadmap of basic science shows points of intervention. It shows points of understanding where we can fortify the spiritual core in the child, the teen, the young adult. To turn that into a school, we didn't want to cook that up in our cauldron on the 3rd floor of my lab, right? We went out and spent 3 years looking at spiritually supportive schools, profoundly diverse across faith traditions and no faith tradition at all, public and independent, highly resourced, under-resourced. We looked at a school formed by the Black Panthers in West Philly. We looked at the extraordinary love and understanding in the Sacred Heart schools. We looked at Brandeis. We looked at all these schools and found that no matter where you are, and you know this through your professional life, the moment you walk in a lobby, you know if you're in a spiritually supportive organization. And it had to do with the gentleman at the door and the head of school and the 8th grade boy or girl. Well, from being part of these schools through multi-methods, we distilled the DNA, the 12 drivers. And to our surprise, it had nothing to do with what lands on the desk. It wasn't a matter of curriculum. It was a matter of the tidal wave, the lived relational culture. These schools formed the 2/3 embrace of the spiritual core. I'll give you just a few examples of the cultural drivers, the DNA. One was there was a school-wide practice of transcendence. And whereas the important work of mindfulness can get us to quiet our minds, these schools then said cross the threshold into a receptive form of transcendent perception. Catch in the catcher's mitt, guidance. Catch in the catcher's mitt, inspiration. A school-wide practice of transcendence. 2, a language of spiritual life. It's real if we call it something. We can share it in our world if we call it something. Spiritual values, receptive knowing, direct connection. At the table of human knowledge inside of us is, of course, the logician and the empiricist, but equally the intuitive, the mystic, and the skeptic. Everybody's there. They're all real forms of perception, human epistemology. Practice of transcendence, language. This is where Aspen is really going to teach our entire country something powerful. A deep relationship with the natural world. Not just that nature's pretty, although it's exquisite, and the important work of recycling, of course, but a deep, profound relationship, a two-way relationship with nature. And what that sounds like is an 8th grade boy saying, you know, I'm leaving my K-8 next year, and I'm ready to go to high school. He was being recruited for football, but, you know, I'm going to miss one thing. When I was in kindergarten, everyone got to pick a tree, and that became our tree. And over the years, every time anything's gone wrong, I've asked the tree what to do, and sometimes I just sit by the tree, and I just feel such peace and love. And then he cried. So you can be the teachers of the deep spiritual force in and through all life, and how that can be supported here in Aspen. I want to share a thought, which is what I see when I walk through Aspen are sparkly eyes. What I see is a community in a state of grace. I think you're perfectly positioned to help our country in this way.
Thank you. Thank you. So we have about 3 minutes. I want to try and sneak in 2 questions. So if we can take them both together, one here and one in the back, and then Lisa can work her magic and answer them both at the same time.
I just find what you're saying so hopeful.
Yes.
The fact that you're saying, yes, there is a spiritual perspective that is recognized by science.
Yes.
And I wonder if you have seen anything in science of the idea of the evolution of consciousness. Is this something that you've seen or you can talk about at all?
That is a marvelous, beautiful, rich question, and there is very little. There's very little, but there's very little. Yes, there's some work done by Julia Mossbridge and Dean Radin who have chosen to work outside of universities, doing very rigorous, very intelligent work. Dean Radin and Julia Mossbridge and some others. And there's a society which was formed actually through the Spirituality Mind Body Institute, and is now a national, international society, the Academy for Post-Material Consciousness-Based Sciences, to address through the method of science the questions that we are exploring of unitive consciousness, if consciousness is existing independent of matter, the Actor-Berg study. So it is there. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. And we'll get one more question back here.
So I want to say thanks to Gina and Jerry first. Amazing, incredible. And
thank
you. And Gina's a dear friend. I just want to say one share that my greatest spiritual awakening experience was when my son took his life last summer. And I really want to ask the question because I believe that we don't die. And so I believe our soul comes in to have an experience. And so I'm really curious about that work that I'm sure, Dr. Miller, you're doing around helping people heal by understanding that that is part of the journey, is to have a human experience and then have this transcendent experience, and it's not personal. So I'm curious about research into that piece, which is, where do we go from here?
Thank you. In The Spiritual Child, I referenced some studies, and the one that jumps to my heart as you share that very powerful story, and thank you for that generosity. A child is born with what scientists have called implicit spiritual cognition. You can use another lens from another field called spirit or soul, we come as knowers, but implicit spiritual cognition. And unless socialized out of it, a child naturally perceives continuity of consciousness or spirit after death, unless told that isn't true. In most of the world, a connection to those who've crossed, our ancestors, is foundational to daily understanding. And when we looked in countries where ancestor connections are essential, we saw that that relationship that you had perhaps at your table, those who truly had your best interest in mind, was profoundly significant and indeed protective against addiction and depression in the way the other things are. So K-12, can we embrace the natural knowing of the child? The child's not a blank slate. It's like a language capacity. They come as knowers. And if someone says, I felt my grandma, or I was talking to my grandpa, or I had this experience, we don't have to be great theologians to simply say, wow, and not rub it out. I think that's one of our greatest contributions, to honor the direct experience of a child. Another example is that a child will perceive that we can directly know, immediately know, without necessarily having been told or read through a mechanistic path. This is our birthright. Now, we need both achieving awareness and awakened awareness. We need to solve challenges and then see perhaps what life is showing us, perhaps receive inspiration of the heart or a mystical experience, and then discern what that means in our lives. Head and heart unified. And when we do, when we get everyone at the inner table, the mystic, the logician, the empiricist, the intuitive talking, and the skeptic, we myelinate the tracks between regions of the brain. We pave pathways. And we have a more innovative brain, a more creative brain, a more situationally aware brain to solve and explore and discover the extraordinary journey in our life and in the work where we are leaders.
I just want to close by saying thank you to you for being here. You know, one of the things that Dr. Miller talks about in her work is relational spirituality. And for you all to be here together in this community and being that relation, the spiritual community, your presence, your engagement this evening, it means a lot to each of us, including you all. So thank you all. Thank you, Dr. Miller. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.